Breaking news. Canon caught testing the R1. Sony is launching 3 new cameras, including one that might be based on Android. And we have new lenses for Canon, Nikon, and Sony. I'm going to tell you all about it. But first, I want to thank our sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace.com/Tony is where you start when you need any presence on the web. Forget social media. That's okay for promoting your main website, but you need your own domain. Like I have northrupphotography.com. What is your domain going to be? Start a store, take appointments from clients, see detailed analytics. Make it possible by starting at squarespace.com/Tony. Try it out completely free, no credit card. When you love it, use the coupon code Tony and you'll get 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace. Our top story, before we get to the big news, is some new lenses. Canon leaked the APS-C 10-18 lens. This is a super wide angle lens with an equivalent of 16 to 29 f7.2 to f10. So it's going to have really deep depth of field. It's probably going to be inexpensive, I think about $300, but this is so sorely needed because Canon has some amazing APS-C cameras like this Canon R10 that won our Camera of the Year award. They're inexpensive and more capable than any other cameras at that price point, in my opinion. But with their kit lenses, the widest they can go is like 29 millimeter equivalent, which is not even as wide as your normal cell phone lens. So that was a real drawback. And every time I recommended them, I had to warn people like, okay, you're going to be taking a few steps back from everything compared to what you're used to. Now, finally, Canon is launching the ultra-wide lens that people buying these cameras need. Canon also actually launched the 10 to 20 f4. Now this has similar focal length numbers, but this is a full frame lens designed for their full frame cameras. That's right, 10 millimeters in full frame. Talk about ultra wide. When I reviewed Sony's 12 to 24 millimeter lens, I decided I was never going to need anything wider than 16 millimeters. That's one of the few lenses where I'm like, this is a perfect lens. I'm never going to buy it because I don't need to go wider than 16 millimeters. Things get like really distorted, and there's actually very few real life scenes where 12 millimeters doesn't seem bizarre and doesn't include lots of like distractions. Like it's not actually good for landscapes. You'd have to be so close to something and have such sweeping views. Even mountains in the distance would be like really tiny with a 12 millimeter lens. So this goes way beyond that to 10 millimeters. That's a big difference between 10 and 12 millimeters. And I don't even imagine very many scenarios where you'd ever want to go that wide. Still, it's really nice that Canon is opening it up and providing some really versatile lenses for those who do need it. The lens itself is $2,300, not a small investment, but if you do buy it, use our link here to help support us. Other lens news, Photo Trend out in France did an interview with a product manager at Sony where he talked about either a refresh for the 85 f1.4 or a new 85 f1.2. And the 85 f1.4 was one of their first G Master lenses. It was great at the time, but we own it. We use it for portraits. And honestly, when it comes time to break out the 85, I grab my Canon R5 and I use my Canon 85 f1.2 because it's a better lens. It has more background blur. And for portraits, the things I use it for, I really like that extra versatility. And it's a shame when I'm forced to switch away from Sony to Canon just because I want a different lens. So I really think Sony has to make an 85 f1.2 lens just to keep up with Canon and Nikon. So I think we're going to see the 85 f1.2. Nonetheless, this isn't really confirmation of anything because the product manager very specifically said that Sony does not release a lens roadmap and they keep things very confidential. And my guess is that he does not have any inside information. I know from working with Sony that often very important people inside the company learn about things at the exact same time I do. That's how secretive Sony is. In other actual news, Nikon released the 600mm f6.3 PF lens. This is not a rumor, this is real. Here's the catch, it's $4,800. It is very similar in specs to this lens that we loved, the Nikon 180-600. This got a fantastic review from us. This is also 600mm f6.3 when you zoom it in all the way. And it's only $1,700. So it has the exact same reach, the exact same light gathering ability, the exact same background blur at 600 millimeters as this prime. So why would you pick a prime lens at like 3 times the cost almost compared to a zoom lens that has more versatility and produces similar images? I think that is a really tough argument that Nikon is going to face. Now, the 600 prime is about a pound lighter. So you might want the ultimate in lightweight, but at the same time, the people who want a light lens also need the versatility of a zoom, because if you need lightweight, maybe you're on a kayak, maybe you're hiking, and you don't exactly know what to expect. And would you pay more than $3,000 more to save a pound of weight? Now, the prime lens could be sharper, but are those differences going to show up in the real world? Well, subscribe to this channel, because as soon as that's available, we're going to do a roundup of all of Nikon's wildlife lenses, and they now have a lot of them, including the 800mm f6.3 and that 600mm f4 TC that is finally shipping to us after like 6 months of waiting on a pre-order list. Sony has 3 new cameras coming, and we know this because of Sony Alpha rumors. Be sure to subscribe to their YouTube channel and follow their blog. Here's how we know. When you're planning to launch a product in China that has Wi-Fi capabilities, you have to register it, and those registrations seem to be public. So we'll see registrations come up long before the launch of a new camera. They don't tell us a lot, but they tell us a few key things. First, of course, it's for Wi-Fi registration, so we know what bands of Wi-Fi they communicate on. But there's also a code in there that indicates whether the lens is domestic to China or an import. That tells us a little bit about the camera, because Sony tends to produce their high-end stuff either in Japan or in their Thailand factory, which I personally have visited. The lower and mid-range cameras are manufactured in China, thus they'd be considered domestic to China. That includes cameras like the A7 IV. So what we see are 2 of these have a J in the middle that indicates that they're imported cameras, and thus might be higher end cameras. One of them has a P indicating that it's domestic in China, and thus might be mid-range or lower. That's all we have to go on. But what are our guesses? Well, there are very solid rumors from Sony Alpha rumors about the Sony A9 Mark III coming. And we've covered this previously, but I'm guessing it's going to be about $4,000 to compete with the Nikon Z8. 45 megapixels, 26 frames per second, and again, with the Z8 as a benchmark here, it'll produce 8K at 60 frames per second or 4K at 120 frames per second, and I bet it will have a tilt screen like previous generations of the A9 as opposed to a flippy screen. So what's the other imported camera? Well, it would be very sensible for Sony to produce an FX video-centric camera based on that same A9 Mark III platform, creating a new top-end camera in the lineup, and it would share those same video features of 8K at 60 frames per second or 4K 120, but the form factor would be different. They have like tripod mounts all over them. They basically have a built-in cage. They don't have a viewfinder, and they do have a tilty screen. So what's that third domestic to China camera? I think Sony desperately needs a competitor to the Canon R8. The Canon R8 is a $1,400 full-frame camera that is pretty amazing. We recommend it extremely highly. It has fantastic autofocus, 4K at 60 frames per second. Sony needs to compete with that, and I think a Sony A5 would be perfect to fill that slot. I'm going to price it directly competing with the R8 with very similar specs, because honestly, these product launches tend not to be super creative. So $1,400, 24 megapixels, 4K 60, and a flip screen. I've seen in the comments some of you have been asking, where's our Android camera? We did an entire video called Sony's Secret Plan, and we outlined the theory that Sony has been building up over the past several years to release cameras with a whole new operating system based on Android, specifically to enable new capabilities and to speed up the software development. This would put Sony at a huge advantage compared to Canon and Nikon, who are still forced to build their software into very antiquated operating systems requiring really laborious coding anytime they want to add new software. And by adding in perhaps an entirely invisible layer of Android, they could add so many software-based capabilities at a much faster rate. Is it possible that one of these 3 cameras will be based on Android? I do think that is entirely possible. And if it were me in charge of product management, I would launch it with one of the low-end cameras. I think a Sony A5 with Android built in would be perfect, rather than launching it on a professional camera like an A9 Mark III, where any sort of bug could screw up a professional shoot. I'd want to work those bugs out in a public forum in entry-level enthusiast cameras rather than pushing it to pros. And finally, the really big news. Canon Rumors is reporting that the Canon R1, their flagship mirrorless camera that we've been waiting for so many years, it's been spotted in the wild. It is currently being tested. And this makes absolute sense for me. You know why? Because we have the Olympics coming up in 2024, and every time the Olympics comes up, Canon, Nikon, and Sony, they all have a big sports-centric product launch. Now, Sony and Nikon launched their flagship mirrorless cameras years ago. Now, the Z9 and the Sony A1. Canon shortly thereafter launched the Canon R3, which is not their flagship camera. That's not my judgment. Canon specifically said this is not the R1 when they named it R3. The one is going to be their top-end camera. This launched shortly after the Sony A1, but it does not match the Sony A1's specs. The Sony A1 is 50 megapixel, 30 frames per second RAW. This is 24 megapixels at 30 frames per second RAW, which is what you generally use for normal shooting. So it doesn't match Sony. And I don't think Canon wanted to call this an R1 and face the fact that they had half the megapixels of Sony, so they last minute renamed it the R3. So I think this is what the Canon R1 will look like. They'll probably use this exact same body, probably without the gimmicky eye tracking autofocus thing, while bumping up all of the specs, offering at least 50 megapixels and certainly more than 30 frames per second, because they don't want to be caught behind Sony and Nikon anymore. Canon Rumors did share some bad news. While we expect an announcement in the first quarter of 2024, that's January, February, March 2024, they said the Canon R1 is not going to have quad pixel autofocus. I thought Canon was holding back the R1 until they could create proper quad pixel autofocus. Right now, these Canon cameras, they have what's called Dual Pixel Autofocus, and that was launched with the Canon 70D like 8 years ago, a long time ago. But Dual Pixel Autofocus has a severe weakness. While it can focus on horizontal lines really well, when it comes to vertical lines, it gets a little bit lost. And that is a problem for sports photographers. You definitely run into situations where these cameras will lose autofocus depending on the patterns on jerseys, something like that. It's not common, but Canon wants their flagship to be perfect. By having 4 pixels there, you actually get diagonal phase detect autofocus, vertical, horizontal. It goes every way, and the autofocus should be absolutely bulletproof. But apparently Canon couldn't make it happen in time for the R1 launch, which I think was already delayed. So they're going to push it out for the Olympics without that feature. But certainly it should have some big specs, and we should see faster frame rates and higher megapixels than we've previously seen from Canon in the past. Don't forget to check out our sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is where you start for all of your website needs. Squarespace.com/Tony gets you a free website trial where you can check out the different templates, see how easy it is to set up. If you're creating a portfolio, bring in your videos, bring in your photos, make it absolutely beautiful. Add your own custom domain name, set up a store, take appointments from clients, distribute images back to clients. It is a key part of our workflow. Between Chelsea and I, we have 4 or 5 different Squarespace hosted websites. We are a true believer. We pay for them too. Thank you very much for making an amazing platform, Squarespace. Check it out for yourself at squarespace.com/Tony. And when you love it, after your trial, the coupon code Tony gets you 10% off. Thanks. Bye.